Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Meaningful People Podcast. So happy to have you here. We have an awesome episode this week. Honestly, it's maybe one of my favorites. We recorded it a little while ago, but we were able to sit down with Rabbi David Fohrman from Aleph Beta fame, and buckle your seatbelts, get a chumash, and get ready.
Yeah, Rabbi Fohrman is a guest that we've been waiting to have on, and he's actually local, but then he was in California for a bunch, and we finally got him in, and I think he blew both of our minds.
Yes.
Safe to say, right?
So go ahead and give it a listen. This episode is powered by the JOWMA Podcast. Dr. Alisa Minkin sits down with top doctors and health professionals around the world to discuss important health topics. Go ahead, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, search the JOWMA Podcast. Enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Meaningful People Podcast, the podcast where we talk to people who are...
meaningful.
Yeah, that sounds good.
We are joined here by Rabbi David Fohrman. It's such a pleasure to have you. I want to start off by saying that, just disclaimer, I'm a huge fan of Aleph Beta, and it's kind of like
Who isn't a huge fan?
little trippy to see you in person, because usually you're a cartoon when I'm watching you. And those who aren't familiar, you got to get the Aleph Beta app.
Well, I was actually born as a cartoon. The human part was just a transformation later.
Wow.
That's the evolution of it. And I'm sure we'll get a lot more, into Aleph Beta, but just wanted to start off saying that what you're doing is incredible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say I am most overwhelmed, I think, with having you as a guest, because...
Are you overwhelmed right now?
Yeah.
Do we need to take a breather?
No, I really... And we've been speaking for maybe almost a year at this point, back and forth, but there's really so much that we really want to get to with you about everything you're doing and your past, so hopefully we'll be able to get to that. But take us from the start of, where you're from.
Sure. I'll just say parenthetically that I'm tempted to turn the tables on you guys and interview you on how you got to know Aleph Beta and how it changed in your perception. Because just say this really quickly as a tease, and we can come back to this later. But one of the things about Aleph Beta is I always think of Steve Jobs when I think of I call it the Steve Jobs problem. When Steve Jobs launched the iPad, he said, I didn't do any market research. I didn't try to figure out what people wanted. I had a concept for what was out there, but I couldn't explain it to anybody because the product didn't exist. And I couldn't ask people, would you want this if it exists? So there was no way to market it other than to say, you need to experience this. And once you experience it, you'll kind of understand. And I kind of felt that with Aleph Beta it was something like that. What we were trying to do was different, and there was no way that anything you could say in marketing wouldn't sound genuine about it. So what happens is when people first kind of discover it, it just looks like a cartoon. It sort of seems like it's for kids. You're not quite sure what it is, and then it sort of draws you in. So one of the things I'm always curious about when people first discover it is what it was like the first time you saw it, and how it is that you began to see it differently. Or what
I could answer that. Okay, so first of all, I don't know what year did Aleph Beta start?
Gee, I'm not even sure. I think it was about 2012-ish.
Okay, so when it started, it was well before, I think it was still at the point where it was known in the world, internet does not equal Torah. It's the opposite, and you were out there.
I don't even know if Yeshiva world existed then.
So at first, I think my oldest brother, Avi, sent me a clip, and I'm like, oh, this is cool. Honestly, I didn't understand really what it was, but I'm like, oh, it's cute cartoons on the Parsha. That's what I thought. Mm-hmm. And then as I watched it, and I think as I got older, and I'm like, whoa, this is the cartoons are nice, and I think that's what drew me in, but I'm like, there's a lot deeper content and Torah going on over here.
You're a big Marvel fan, right? So that makes sense that the cartoons drew you.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, really. I that's what got me. I got engaged through it.
I think for me, I think you spoke at my yeshiva.
Which yeshiva?
Rabbi Yisachar Blinder, Pinchas Weimer.
Oh, you were there. Yeah, I remember that.
So you spoke a few times. Then I think it was also coinciding around Pesach time, and I bought the book you just put out. And then it happens to be last year, Purim, I became a paid user of Aleph Beta. Got a full-blown account.
Amazing.
And I just to be able to listen and watch something about, Queen Esther and I think the Queen Esther Gambit, you called it or something.
The Queen's Gambit.
The Queen's
right?
Gambit.
I think we must have played off of the Netflix.
Yeah, must have. Or Netflix got it from you, of course.
Absolutely.
But it was just the depth that the content had was so amazing to me, and to be able to be broken down in such a simple way and be presented in such a digestible way was amazing. So I just kept going at it. I sometimes watch it with my wife before Yom Tovim, but I think I was just introduced to it word of mouth. Everyone knows Aleph Beta. Aleph Beta, again, like Yaakov said, it preceded everything in the market. Aleph Beta was first as a resource, as putting out content. So you speaking publicly somewhere, I guess, got another user. Interesting.
That's kind of cool. I'll tell you a funny story. Because for me, when I'm making this stuff, people often ask, "So who's your audience? Who are you trying to get this in front of?" And I don't actually think about it that way. I think about I have something I really want to share, and my audience is whoever finds that interesting. And but the people who find it interesting are really very curious, and so I kind of, in my mind's eye, I think I'm talking about sophisticated things. I'm talking to adults. I'm talking about, but often it's like kids who are really drawn to the cartoons who will really get into this. And, like a mom came over to me at a break in a talk and said, I need to tell you a story about the Queen Esther piece, So I said, yeah. So she says, so my daughter comes to me and asks me one night, Mom, I found this video on Aish on Queen Esther. It's a cartoon. Could I watch it? So I said, sure. And so she's watching it, and like an hour later, she's still watching it. And, an hour and a half goes by, and she's like glued there, and she finishes. So next day, her teacher, she was in, I think, BYA or something, one of these Beis Yaakov elementary schools in Brooklyn. And her teacher asks the class, did anybody see anything new and interesting on the Megillah? And she raised her hand, and she expertly summarized an hour and a half video in about 7 minutes. And the teacher was like blown away. And it's like, where did you find that? And so called her mother, and it's like, where did your daughter find any of that? And so mom asked daughter, and she says, Mom, it's a video, right? Like, how did you remember that? Because kids swim in video, and it's just somehow in the YouTube generation, it just feels as natural and as effortless as anything. But fascinatingly, you can get kids who are really, really young to perceive content that you would think is way over their heads, much more sophisticated for them. But if you can use pictures, and if you can use the visual medium effectively to really illustrate ideas, somehow, kids will surprise you.
And I want to get into the methodology of like Aleph Beta and everything about it. But first, take us back to like where you're from and kind of leading up until how you got to making Aleph Beta.
Okay, an origin story.
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. So I grew up in the Bay Area in California, actually.
Dub Nation, yeah.
What's that?
Dub Nation, no.
Dub Nation, no. You lost me there.
He lost both of us. What are you talking about?
Golden State Warriors.
It's a sports
the Bay
reference.
Area is called Dub. It's called Dub Nation. But
No
I guess,
kidding. Yes.
I guess not.
So I wasn't really.
It is, but
I was a Giants fan, not a Warriors fan.
Tough loss last night.
I know, that was terrible.
That wasn't a swing, by the way. It wasn't a swing.
I
did
hear
you tweet
If
about
you know, you know. I totally did.
Yeah. So the Giants broke my heart early on. Joe Angel, and he's I think he's still with the team, by the way. His voice is so distinctive. Right. He was the play-by-play broadcaster for them. So I went to I grew up going to sleep at listening to Giants games on my transistor radio, and my dad was a psychiatrist, and my mom and father had. Both grew up in kind of traditional Jewish homes, got closer to Judaism through actually Shlomo Carlebach, who was had built the House of Love and Prayer. My father ended up being kind of the resident psychiatrist in the House of Love and Prayer, which definitely kept him busy. I went to kind of a little one-room schoolhouse in Oakland, a school that my parents helped to build. I can proudly say I was the valedictorian of my class, but I would have to let you know that the entire class was 13 kids, and that was 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and there were only about 3 of us 8th graders, so it wasn't really the greatest accomplishment in the world. But it was really like a one-room schoolhouse. It was It was a special kind of time. And then there was a little Orthodox shul in town, and we would walk there. And it was a few miles. It was about 2.5, 2.75 miles away, and up big hills, and getting back was a real stretch. But even as a kid, I became kind of captivated with the drushas, the sermons of the rabbi there. The rabbi was a special fellow who was named Yosef Leibowitz, and I think he was kind of like my earliest influence in this. And he had a way of looking at Chumash that I found captivating, even at an early age. I remember my father died when I was young. My father, Alav Shalom Moshe Fohrman, was also a real influence on my life. He was, as I mentioned, he was a psychiatrist, and in some kind of way, everything I know I learned in kindergarten from him. In terms of he would, I'm not sure if it was because he knew he was dying or something, but he shared a lot of really sophisticated insights with me at a really young age, in a very experiential kind of way. If I had problems with my teachers or stuff at school, and the approaches he would give me to dealing with that were kind of revelatory in ways of handling situations and the foibles of human nature.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, he would talk about double messages a lot, right? What we would call echad b'peh ve'echad b'leiv, right? But it would be, it was something which he would catch me on a lot, which is that, if you said something, but your heart was somewhere else, and there was, and you were using, sometimes you could sort of use sarcasm or a little bit of bitterness to make a point, and you're not even aware that that's there in there. And to be able to have that self-awareness and to be able to try to align what's really in your heart with the honesty of how you're speaking was something that was really important to him. And that was a piece. Another things he said was that you can never. I remember advice just as a kid going up in school. If I ever had a conflict with a teacher, he would say, look, the power dynamics in the classroom are such that you can't win against a teacher, right? Yeah. And so the first thing you need to know is, right, maybe that's different now, but the first thing you need to know is the teacher's an authority and you're not, right? So what you need to figure out is how you can find a workable solution, right, given the limits of your actual power in this situation. And basically what he was coaching me towards was there are more as Obi-Wan Kenobi once said to Han Solo in Star Wars, there are more ways to win a battle than by fighting. And fighting seems to be the most obvious way to win a battle, which is conflict, but there's other ways to reach an amiable resolution. If you read later on in life, I got to read, the Harvard Negotiations Project, Getting to Yes, how to negotiate in a tough way, but in a way that's actually fair and actually compassionate at the same time. And I found that, my father was kind of helping with some of those principles when I was, in fourth grade. So I learned a lot from him. He was a very special man. And when he died, Rabbi Leibowitz, who was the rabbi I was talking about, became a bit of a father figure to me. I remember him helping me with my bar mitzvah drasha as a kid, and he did something which was unusual, something which I'll challenge people to do in Aleph Beta land, which is, instead of here's a really interesting idea, let me teach it to you, and here's your, pshetel that you'll say. What he said is, look, I just want you to open a Tanakh and read your parsha, it's Noach, and come back to me with, the 2 or 3 things that you found most puzzling, in the text. And I found that just so freeing to be able to just read and to actually come to you with what I think the real problems were, and then we would have a conversation about it. And then he said, "Okay, that's your bar mitzvah. You just said it. Now go and write it." And it was a very exciting way to begin to approach Tanakh. Anyway, when I was, as I mentioned, my father died when I was young, and when I was, it was, I suppose, in the middle of my 9th grade year. The 8th grade yeshiva world that I had gone to came to a conclusion. I spent the beginning of 9th grade in Berkeley High, in a public high school, all sorts of interesting stories of what it was like to be a young Jew in Berkeley, California, in Berkeley High. But that came to a change when my mom remarried. She married Zev Wolfson, and we came out and joined the extended Wolfson family here. We weren't in the Five Towns then; we were in Kew Gardens. But that was a real shift, right? That kind of shift from sort of quasi long-haired Berkeley kid of the 70s, coming to a pretty buttoned-down, traditional Orthodox Kew Gardens community, and that was a real. It was quite a shift. I went to yeshiva and Rabbi Riskin school, eventually went to Ner Yisrael. And one of the things that struck me as fascinating in that journey was that there seemed to be this shift moving from California to New York in Jewish education. And one of the ways the shift expressed itself is that Chumash and Tanakh suddenly wasn't really on the agenda anymore.
Huh.
Like I was a kid and I was reading a lot of Gemara, and that was very fascinating, but somehow not a lot of Chumash. Chumash was like self-study on your own, and you had a bechina you had a test on Rashi's at the end. And it just struck me that it was being de-emphasized, and I couldn't figure out why. Nobody was really reading it. And I remember sitting on the lawn in Ner Yisrael at one point and thinking to myself, like, look, if you really believe that there's a God in this world, and you really believe that God wrote this book, like he actually gave you this book, the one thing we agree on is this book was written by God, right? So you've got to believe that God was smart enough, right, to say something meaningful in that book, that every generation is going to be able to take some of the most meaningful things in their life from that book. So why isn't anyone reading it, really? I just couldn't really understand it. And even my own attempts to read the book and find meaning, I found very frustrating. I remember vividly being on the lawn in Ner Yisrael and kind of opening Shmos and saying, okay, I'm going to read this. I'm going to try to understand what's really going on, what's really happening. And I just couldn't do it. I didn't have the tools. It almost felt like I was trying to fix a car without a toolbox. I just didn't really know how to do it. And so I was very frustrated with that and kind of closed it. But in the back of my mind, it had always been something I was kind of interested in doing. The next kind of chapter in my life, I would say, in this kind of development of Aleph Beta took place in, when was it? It was, I would say, the early 90s. And what had happened then was there was a television show that was broadcast, which was a discussion group on the Bible led by Bill Moyers. Actually, Bill Moyers filmed it. The discussion group was called Genesis, A Living Conversation. It was run by a conservative rabbi in various homes, and it went on TV on PBS. And what that show did was it actually made the study of Bible kosher in very secular circles. So you weren't considered some fundamentalist crazy guy reading the Bible if you were a straight button-down lawyer, because PBS had a show on the Bible, and so it was respectable again. So around that time, there was a bookstore in Baltimore called Be Below. Oliver Shalom doesn't exist anymore, but it was in the days before Amazon and the days before even Barnes & Noble came and took over everything. There were these strong, big, independent bookstores, and Be Below was one of them. So Be Below had a wonderful Judaic section, and I would kind of hang around there a little bit and look at books and things. And one of the people there approached me and asked and said, we're going to be doing a version of Bill Moyer's discussion group. We're going to have a discussion group in the bookstore, and we're inviting a panel, and we'd like to invite you. Would you be part of this panel? And I'd gotten to know this lady, and I agreed, and I promptly forgot about it, only to be called by the bookstore 3 months later, and they said, so we just want to let you know, you're speaking as part of this panel in about a week. And here's the time, here's the place. So I said, okay, so what's the topic? Just remind me of the topic. It's going to be Jacob's deception of Isaac and Esau. So I said, okay, so who else is in the panel? So he said, well, we had a hard time getting people on the panel. It's just going to be you and the chairman of the Department of Philosophy from the College of Notre Dame. So that's when I realized like I was going to be the sacrificial rabbi in the room, right? And what was I going to say?
And you were a rabbi at this point?
Well, yes, I was a rabbi. I had spent some time doing the rabbi thing. I mean, the other parts of my life, which I'm sort of cutting away here, is I'd spent a number of years. I'd spent 7 years by this time working for Artscroll on the Shas project, the Shansin edition of the Talmud.
Wow.
I translated Kiddushin for them. That was the truth is it's a
pretty big deal.
Yeah, it's an important part of the story for Aleph Beta in the sense that if you think about what was significant about Artscroll, what made the Shas project wonderful, really why I loved working for it, was because it was a chance to take, again, super sophisticated ideas and challenge yourself to how simple can you make a super sophisticated idea without oversimplifying it, right? Which is one of the big things in Aleph Beta land also. Just how exactly do you do that? It was something which I had challenged myself in Ner Yisrael to do back in, I was a big fan of Rabbi Berkowitz, one of the Maggidei Shir in Baltimore, and his stuff was really sophisticated, but he had this ability to use plain English to be able to explain a difficult point, and I picked up on that, and I challenged myself in writing notes in his shiurim. A lot of people would write notes in Hebrew. I would do my Hebrew notes, but then I would actually do notes in English without even one Hebrew word to see, like, could you take these really sophisticated ideas and translate them into something with someone with no Talmudic background could understand? And that kind of became the background to me getting involved in Artscroll with what it is that they're doing, and then taking that and then moving it into Tanakh, really with Aleph Beta.
Well, back to the show. You're sacrificial
So
rabbi.
I'm the
show.
sacrificial rabbi at the show. So what happened was I was caught flat-footed because nothing I learned in yeshiva had prepared me in the least to do what I was about to do. Like, what am I supposed to do? Like, say, guys, Esav, he was mamash a Russia Marusha. I mean, it was very bad. Chazal say he was Odo Zara, Gila Arai, Shvichas Dam, all in one day. He deserved what was coming to him. It was the worst. Like, you've got a group of 120 secular people there, only half of whom are even Jews. You have the chairman of the Department of Philosophy of the College of Notre Dame. You just can't do that. So circumstances forced me to do something which I wasn't used to doing in Chumash, which is, just go back to the text, read the text carefully, and try to make sense of it. And then what I found is that as I began to do that, in this story and in other stories consistently, then Chazal themselves began to look differently. In other words, it's like, oh, wow, when Chazal said strange things in the Medrash, sometimes the things that they were saying in the Medrash were emerging from the text in remarkable kinds of ways, and you began to see how the text and Chazal played off of each other. Anyway, to make a long story short, I eventually developed a theory. I don't even remember exactly what it was at the time. By my current standards, I don't think it was the greatest theory in the world, but it was a theory. It was a way of looking at the story that seemed like it could work. So I took a chance. It turns out that I knew the guy, the chairman of the Department of Philosophy at the College of Notre Dame. I knew him because I had taken a course of his in college. Ner Yisrael has a college program. At the time, it was on Johns Hopkins. I did a little bit of a different program that other people didn't really do back in my day in Ner Yisrael. Basically, what I said was, look, I've been in yeshiva for 3 years. I've never gone to college. I'm really just looking for basic secular education. But rather than start over and have to do 120 credits and get my yeshiva credits and put that all together, what if I got a yeshiva degree for a bachelor's? And Johns Hopkins has this 30-credit master's degree in history of ideas, and it's just these really cool professors who get to talk about what they're most passionate about in humanities and psychology and sociology and philosophy and literature and in economics, and I'll do that. And it was a wonderful. It gave me a chance to learn how to write And that's kind of what I did. And one of my courses, which I really liked, was actually from this professor. His name was Stephen Vicchio. He became a friend for many, many decades after that. And so I called Stephen, who I kind of been out of touch with since college. And I said, look, there's a kosher restaurant. Can I take you out to dinner? We're both speaking at this thing. And I did. And I ran my shot by him, basically. And he loved it. And he said, let's co-present it. And that's what we did. And he became like my kosher stempel, you know, and everybody listened to him. And they thought it was great. And the bookstore came back. And basically the moral of it, which we both kind of said, was here's a story that at face value seems a certain way. But if you pay attention to clues, right, the Bible is a much deeper document than you suspect it really is. And if you read it deeply, it begins to reveal itself to you. Bookstore loved it, said, could he come back and do it again? And that kind of became the beginning of at least my research journey, which is every month it was like the Arabian Nights. You know, we'd take another. I would kind of take another challenge on somewhere in Tanakh. Meet Stephen for dinner, and we discuss it. We come up with something, present it. Eventually, he dropped out. I did those. Continued to do it myself, but that became the beginnings of Aleph Beta. I parlayed that actually into a course at Johns Hopkins University. I approached the dean of the School of Humanities, Tom Crane at the time, and kind of sold him on this idea to do a course in Genesis. And that was a magical experience. It was a night course that people from the community came to through Johns Hopkins, and it was supposed to go for 8 sessions. It went for 16 sessions. They wanted to continue afterwards. It was a not-for-credit course. It was just a kind of an adult ed thing through Johns Hopkins. And I remember vividly at the end, this medical professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine who was there, Jerry. So he raised his hand and said, can I ask you a question? So I said, sure. He said, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Bible's authorship. So this was a question that I studiously avoided, and it was just like, look, here's a classic of Western literature. It all comes back to the Bible. Let's learn it together. So I kind of defensively said, sure, what do you mean? So he said, well, I'd always been taught that the Bible was crafted by a whole bunch of different authors, and there was an E author, and there was a J author, and then there was this editor that somehow kind of threw things together. He says, but I don't really see how that could be. I mean, there's just so much unity underneath the surface of this text that's weaving together. I mean, Deuteronomy is so connected with Genesis, it's so connected with it. I mean, there's all these layers. I just don't see how more than one really smart being could have somehow put that together. So I said, and I didn't even pay him to say that. So it was a really magical kind of course.
Wow.
So that was kind of how my journey sort of began.
Wow.
Hold it right there for a quick second. Of course, we want to pay some homage to our sponsor for this episode, JOWMA. Go ahead and listen to their podcast, led by Dr. Alisa Minkin. She sits down with top doctors, health professionals around the world, and discusses important health topics.
Yeah, it's really I mean, they have, I don't know, over 100 episodes already, and she really sits down with the best of the best, and they go into it, whether it's wellness, mental health, specific, fields in medicine. I would say physician world, but that does not make sense. And yeah, it's a really informative, very interesting time. And they even do a segment on just different medical professions that people go into. Like people spend their whole lives thinking about, okay, which type of medical journey will I go down? You could hear a person that they went down it and hear about them, and it's a beautiful organization. Have you listened to any of the episodes?
I've listened to 103 of them already.
Wow, that's
obviously
amazing.
So go ahead and give them a listen. The JOWMA Podcast. Search on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. But for now, we're going to get back to our episode. That's it was funny. You started off by sort of saying how it started on the lawns of Ner Yisrael. And I was going to ask you if you saw Rabbi Fohrman laying there also, because his story also he was sitting there on the lawn of Ner Yisrael looking at the stars. And right now I'm picturing you sitting over here and I'm sitting over here, and the world just changing because of both of you.
So Rabbi Fohrman was a contemporary of mine there. Actually, we were together in those early days. One of the things I did is I took the stuff that I was doing at Johns Hopkins and I brought it into the Beis Medrash as a little chabura. This is in the early 2000s. It was kind of during Musar Seder, but it grew and grew, and Rabbi Fohrman was part of that. So we got to know each other back then.
It seems like there's so much going on during these years, and you were so committed to this project. What was sort of, I guess, powering you under the surface? Where does that passion come from, or what is it that like kept you just committed to such a thing?
I guess that's a good question. I suppose what I had seen early on, I mean, I go back to the story I told you back in Berkeley. I think what I had seen with Rabbi Leibowitz was in listening to those drushas that he gave in shul was the beginning of a sense that Torah could be more than most people think it could be. And let me explain what I mean by that. If you ask your average person on the street, what do you think of the Torah? So they'll tell you, well, the Torah is very deep, it's meaningful, it was written by God, it's spiritual, it's the basis of everything. But if you ask them a different question, if you say, like, how much guidance do you really get on a day-to-day basis from Chumash, right? And like you ask people that honestly, how much does the Bible actually really guide your life, right? Not a lot, right?
And I'm being generous.
Right. Like maybe a Musar Shmooze that I remember from my mashgiach a little bit or something. Or maybe like this book that I read, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits. You know what I mean? Something like that. That guides my life. But Chumash, like 10 Commandments, right? When's the last time you had a moral dilemma, right? In the last 30 days that you went back to the 10 Commandments for guidance. If you haven't been considering murder lately.
Well, guy cut me off, so I but aside from that, I know what you mean. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, and people just don't even expect that, right? To the point, I'll give you a story. When I was doing my chabura in Ner Yisrael during Musar Seder, right? I actually got some pushback from the Hanhala at a point, right?
That's how you know you made it, by the way.
I hear you. So I had folks from the Hanhala, but remain nameless, right, who came by and said, like, you can't do this in the Beis Medrash during Musar Seder. And it was like, why not, right? Because it's not Musar. I said, it's not Musar. It's all about the whole ethical milieu of the Bible. I mean, we're actually living, breathing lessons of how you're supposed to live your Bible. It says, Chumash is not Musar. You get Chumash is Chumash and Musar is Musar. And to me, that was such an interesting thing. It was like, if you can't derive ethical teachings from the book of books in a way that makes sense, it's like, so why are we even here?
So you decided to show it to them by building an entire organization dedicated to proving it.
And their subscribers.
It's not quite as simple as that. But the point is that if you ask me the question, what was the vision? What was the passion? It was like, could you? It felt to me that how we relate to the Bible wasn't really genuine to who we say we are as from Jews. It was like there were folks, your average sermon in shul, right? So if I'm a rabbi, I'm coming together with a sermon. So how do I do it? Like, what's the cheat sheet for rabbis putting together sermons, right? So generally speaking, I'll sit at my study and I'll say, so what do I want to talk about this week? And I'll come up with some idea. And I'll say, I haven't talked about Lashon Hara for a while, right? Let's talk about Lashon Hara. Or there's this communal issue that I really want to address. I really think the community, we should have achdus in the community around this difficult kashrus issue, which is, so let me talk about that. So, but it's Parshas Toldos. So what am I going to come up with in Toldos that has to do with that? So, when Yaakov, he ran away. So, maybe if there was a little bit more unity, it's like, so you come up, you start from backwards, right? You take an idea that you already know and love, right? Which you're invested in. And then you try to like hang it on a coat, almost with a coat hanger with some little piece of text. And The problem is nobody finds any of that compelling, right? Your idea isn't particularly compelling. It was just an idea that you want to hit people over in the head with. Your evidence is anything but compelling. But everybody, there's almost like a social contract that everybody nods their heads and says, Yashakach, that's wonderful. And nobody even really thinks it's true.
So how would you write it? Like you would look at
you almost turn the process on its head, right? The first thing you do is check your baggage at the door. You say, I am starting this process without actually a conclusion in mind. I'm not going to come up with some sort of moral teaching that I want to let everybody know. I'm actually going to read the text. I'm going to start by just reading the text, and I'm going to let the text reveal something to me, right? And I'm going to just observe, right? What's happening in this text? It's strange, right? I'm reading the story of the Etzadas, for example, right? I noticed something odd. I don't know what to make of it, but I noticed something odd. I noticed that when the two trees in the garden, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, are described in the garden, the location is given for only one of the two trees. That's strange. Eitz HaChaim b'toch hagan, right? Ve'etz hadat tov v'ra. And there's a tree of knowledge, but I don't even know where it is. So how come I don't know where the tree of knowledge is? And I know where the tree of life is. The tree of life is in the middle of the garden. That's really weird. That's strange. And I keep on reading, and I get to the part where Eve has this conversation with the snake. And she's chatting with the snake and telling the snake the tree that she's not allowed to eat from. Now, interestingly, she doesn't name it by name. All she does is talk about it by place. So now you say, well, 1 second, we didn't know where the tree of knowledge was, right? So how's she going to talk about it by place? I only know where the tree of life was. The tree that she's not supposed to eat from is the tree of knowledge. She was never told not to eat from the tree of life. So you read what she's talking about, and she says to the Nachash, Miprei etz hagan nochal, we're allowed to eat from the trees of the garden. There's this one tree, Pri ha'etz asher b'toch hagan, amar Elokim lo tochlu mimenu. It's just the tree that's in the middle of the garden that we're not allowed to eat from. Then you say, for 1 second,
aren't they all the middle?
Well, first of all, first, the whole notion of the middle of the garden itself is strange. If you're in a forest, what tree is the middle? Which is the middle tree in the forest?
Exactly.
That's a strange kind of thing. And plus, Eve is misidentifying the tree, because the one tree that the text tells you is in the middle of the forest is actually the tree of life, which she was never told not to eat from. So why is she saying that's the tree she wasn't told to eat from? So what happens is, if you build a constellation of questions, just in these last 2 minutes, we have 3, right? How come there's no location given for the tree of knowledge, but for the tree of life? How come Eve misidentifies the tree? And what tree is in the middle of the garden anyway, if there's a big forest around? So what happens is, invariably, if you can assemble a sort of ensemble of questions, right? What happens is that, and then you kind of keep out of the corner of your eye Chazal kind of in the background. Occasionally, what will happen is these questions align themselves into a way of seeing things that kind of changes your fundamental view of the text, right? In this case, I won't get into it in detail, but this happens to be something I'm working on now, which is the trees in the garden, and what was going on with these 2 special trees in the garden. What will happen is that you put these questions together, you add up your questions, and occasionally there's another piece of the Torah that interweaves with this. In this case, we're talking about the beginning of the Torah. Well, if you go to the end of the Torah, interestingly, there's this, when Moshe's giving his farewell speech to the people, he says famously, Ra'ei nasati lefanecha hayom, see, I've given you today, es ha'chaim ve'es ha'tov, es ha'maves ve'es ha'ra. I've given you that which is life, and I've given you that which is good. I've given you death, and I've given you life. And I'm just thinking about that phrase, and something hit me from the beginning of the Torah, which is, if you kind of think back to the beginning of the Torah, a 4th question you could say is, like, what's even the deal with a garden with 2 special trees that just happen to be called a tree of life on the one hand, and a tree of knowledge of good and evil on the other hand. It's like, that's random. You know what I mean?
It's
like
very true.
It's very random.
I don't really think about this so
right?
much.
It's such a, and it makes for a bad story. Like, what if I told you a story and I said, Nachi and Yaakov, I'm going to make up my own religion. There's going to be this wonderful garden, and there's going to be these two magical trees in it. One tree is a pink polka dotted tree, and the other is a Cadillac tree with buttons on it, right? So you would say, Fohrman, you have to work on your storytelling skills a little bit. These are very random trees. I mean, it's like, of course, you can make whatever world you want, but like everyone knows in a magical world like Harry Potter, the thing that makes the world compelling is that things fit. It's not like random. There's connections between things. You can't have a pink polka dotted tree, and then you can't have a Cadillac tree with buttons. Similarly, you can't have a tree of knowledge of good and evil and a tree of life. Like, what in the world does a tree of knowledge of good and evil have to do with the tree of life? But here at the end of the Torah, along comes Moshe and says, here I've given you today that the good and life, right? And I've given you, right, death, and I'm giving you evil. And all of a sudden you're thinking, oh my goodness, that he just referenced those two trees. Right?
It's like a movie at the end coming together.
It's right.
What? Halavai? Is that
No.
the word?
Halavai? Maybe not Halavai, actually.
Not Halavai. What's the opposite of Halavai?
Kaviyachal?
Yeah. That's it. Kaviyachal.
So to speak. No,
Yeah.
it really is. It's the denouement of the movie. It's the climactic moment. It's almost like, that's what was going on with the
Whoa,
trees.
there it
It's like,
is.
there it
Yeah.
is. I just found the thing that binds together the two trees. The two trees are two different perspectives on God's commands.
This is really one tree.
It's one tree. And now
See,
you think to yourself.
I heard that last Shabbos, Rabbi Yossi Zakatinsky. It's one tree.
So he said, so that's
It's one tree.
So I actually have come to believe that that's true.
Really?
So the next thing
crazy.
is you have to go one step further, and you say Occam's razor. Occam's razor is the philosophical principle that if you can get rid of anything extraneous, you do. You simplify everything. So if there's two trees that each represent two different perspectives on God's commands. And let's just understand what that means for a moment. What does it mean to have a tree of life perspective on God's commands and a tree of knowledge of good and evil on God's commands? So that's easy. If I would ask you, I'd say to you, Yaakov, you're a frum Jew. Imagine I'm Joe on the plane, and I'm some guy, and I meet you, and I see you're an Orthodox Jew, and I'm chatting with you because I'm in seat 17B and you're in 17A. So I say to you, so why do you think the Torah is such a big deal? Like, why is the Torah meaningful to mankind? If you actually think back to one of these trees, you actually have a ready answer to that question, right? Because you can say to him, it's a tree of knowledge of good and evil. In other words, it is a way that God revealed to us what he thinks good is and what he thinks evil is. He's given us his understanding of morality in the Torah, and that's a big deal. Because if human beings don't have an understanding of morality that comes to God, then they don't know what to do, right? Kant has his ideas of the categorical imperative, and Jeremy Bentham has his ideas about utilitarianism, but who's to know who's right? Am I supposed to follow Jeremy Bentham? Am I supposed to follow Kant? It all sounds good to me, but if the master of the universe comes and says, hey guys, I made the world, here's what I think morality is, you listen to the master of the universe. There's a moral code, right? So it's a big deal. The Torah is knowledge of good and evil. But then I can come to you and say, so why do you learn it all day? You're not even doing it lamaisa, right? Even you're learning shor shanaga chazapara. You don't have a shor. You don't have a cow. What do you even do?
I'm a pretty out of the box guy, but yes, I know what you mean. Yeah,
right?
there's a lot of
pieces. And I'm in yeshiva and I'm learning and I'm steiging and I say in Avarabba, I say the Avarabba, you gave you such love, you gave the Torah, right? And I say kihem chayenu v'arach yameinu. Kihem chayenu v'arach yameinu. There's a whole other way of looking at Torah, which is Torah's life. Forget it's the fact that it's a gift that helps me understand what's good and what's evil. It's God's word. If I love God, my problem with loving God is I can't touch God. I can't feel God, right? I can't embrace God. So I have nothing of God in this world, but I do have his words. I do have his commands. So it's like love letters. You know, if you had someone beloved on another continent, if you were fighting in Normandy, and and there was a nurse in Iowa who you loved, but she was in Iowa, and there was no telephone, and there was no, but she could write you letters, and she wrote you, like, you'd embrace that letter. It'd be your life. You're connected. Your mind connects to her mind through this letter. So that's the Torah. So Torah, that God is the source of all life, and kihem, right, and it's chaim hilamachazikim ba. I can grab hold of it. So the notion that the Torah can be seen in two ways, either as this way that I can connect to the source of my life, or these moral teachings that help me actually live in the world, is a really compelling idea. But then you get to Nachi's idea, Nachi's question, which is, so why do you need two trees?
And what you're saying is you cut one off.
You cut one off. So what if the Torah is playing a little game with you, with a wink and a nod? The Torah is saying, yeah, sure, it looks like two trees, but look at it really carefully. Did I ever say there were two trees? And if you actually read the verses carefully, you'll see, darn it, there is no verse.
Really?
Actually, I'm
It's like,
telling
have you ever seen
look at
these
this.
two people in the same place?
Right. It's like, it's Where's Waldo?
Have you ever seen those two trees together?
Right. Have you ever?
This is exactly I'm feeling, honestly, like...
Your first grade Rebbe failed you.
No, I hate referencing movies. I watched when I was young. I don't watch movies anymore. But with spoiler alert, with Bruce Willis at the end of Sixth Sense.
Yes, it's exactly a Sixth Sense thing.
I didn't get to that yet.
You didn't watch it?
You got to see the Sixth Sense.
I don't want to ruin it for you. But it really, feels like
It's
what you're saying now is
exactly
like,
what it is,
oh
yes.
my gosh, the whole time I thought X and it's Y.
The Torah is playing the Sixth Sense with you. It's
I
like
guess that's
I
where
feel
M.
so
Night
firm right now.
Shyamalan
That
got
I'm the only
it
one
from.
who didn't watch this movie. Like,
so.
watch
Spoiler
movies, don't watch
alert:
movies
we can't just tell everybody the end of Sixth, but go watch.
Nah, he had like 25 years to figure that one out.
I know. Man, I don't know. I'm slacking.
But it's a storytelling technique, right? Which is that there's this incredible storytelling technique. Shtisel. Have you been following Shtisel?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
I didn't watch that, so now I feel good.
You
Balancing
have to
each
check
other.
your yichus.
So if you take the third season of Shtisel, right, and how it begins, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen the third season.
They haven't
so
watched it already, then they're not watching.
I'll say it covertly.
Nachi.
It's actually very similar to this two trees thing. So what you have is it begins with the main character who's a frum artist, and he's painting his wife who he just married, painting a portrait of her, and their little baby cries in the crib, and and so he goes to pick her up, and he goes to soothe her, and he gives her a bottle. But you're kind of wondering, like, how come, like, she's crying, he's having a hard time soothing her? Just give him to mom, like, mom will take care of her, right?
Yeah.
But he doesn't do that. Like, it's totally clear that he's going to be one take. And he says, don't move, just keep that pose, don't move. And then she says, I just wish I could have nursed him one last time. And then you think to yourself, like, what was that about? So I just don't even understand what that means. But, you think, all right, that's a weird thing to say. And you sort of like move on. And then it's like he's got these paintings. He's not letting go of the paintings. And he won't sell any of these paintings. And he tells her, we can never sell any of these paintings. And then at the very end, you find out that the person that I don't know if there's a way to say this.
No, say it. Spoiler alert. If you want to watch it, don't listen
spoiler
to this.
alert.
But
Right. What you find out is that she's been dead this whole time.
Yeah.
Right. And it's his imagination, which is so vivid that he's putting there on the chair.
That's awesome.
And of course she can't nurse the baby.
Thanks.
Right. She's not there to nurse the baby. I could have wished I could nurse her one last time. That's why he's not letting go of any of these paintings. And it's in the final scene of that, right, that you when he drives back alone and there's no one in the car, right, and it's just him, and on the way there she was there, and it's like that you begin to realize she's not alive anymore, right, and now everything makes sense in retrospect. And it's a storytelling device where you sort of withhold information. It's almost like the Torah wants to say to you, it's like, you could look at these two trees as separate things, like that's a normal thing to do, right, but deep down, once you really get into story, you have to understand that they're actually the same, that the Torah is seamlessly both a tree of life and a tree of knowledge of good and evil. And by the way, once you realize that's true, so Chava didn't misidentify the tree. When she told the snake that the tree she can't eat from is the tree in the middle of the garden, that's the answer to the question. It's the tree.
And
it's all the same tree.
And it was all about their perspective.
Yes. So now the question you have to ask is, the next question is, okay, so 1 second. If that's really true, that there's all these trees. By the way, the way to read that verse is that God made all these trees in the garden, and they were beautiful to eat and good to look at. right? And he made an Eitz HaChaim b'toch hagan, the Eitz Hadat Tov Ra. That's why there's no location. It's all b'toch hagan. In other words, it's a tree of knowledge of good and evil, a tree of life in the middle of the garden. That's what it is. Parenthetically, you could also see it as a tree of knowledge of good and evil, i.e., fundamentally, it's a tree of life. It's in the middle of the garden. It has another identity. It has another quality to it. It's also a tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then you get to Nachi's question, which is the next question. It's like the methodology just draws you in. And you have to ask yourself, okay, so what then makes it a tree of knowledge of good and evil? How do you know at any given moment if it's the same tree, whether it's a tree of knowledge or a tree of life, right? If God comes to me and says, don't eat from the tree of knowledge, but am I allowed to eat from the tree of life? So what would make it a tree of knowledge? Right. So Nachi said maybe it's perspective. That's a very cool possibility. We would have to go through the verses and see if it actually works and test it. But Nachi's theory would be that you almost have the Schrodinger's cat or the Heisenberg uncertainty theory playing out with the tree. Right?
Yes, the Heisenberg one. Yeah.
The notion in quantum physics, right, which is that light can be both a wave and a particle. And if you're looking for light to be a particle, it'll act like a particle for you. And if you're looking light to be a wave for you, it'll act for, like they actually done experiments, Maxwell's experiments with light, which shows that light can have this dual quality and will almost play with you and will be what you want it to be. And it's almost like the tree, as Nachi is saying, the tree will be what you want it to be. If you view it as a tree of knowledge of good and evil, the theory would be maybe it's a tree of knowledge of good and evil. Or if you view it as a tree of life, it's different.
So what happened?
So the
spoiler alert for whoever doesn't want to know the actual story.
Right. So here's the problem. The problem, though, is that the verses are maddening and it's very difficult to understand. As I began to work on this theory, Nachi's possibility was immediately what I grabbed onto, which is that it has to be. It's a matter of perspective. The problem is it doesn't quite work in the verses because there's one verse that you can't make it work. When they're banished from the garden, why are they banished from the garden? So the text tells us, Heina Adam haya ka'achad mimenu ladas tov v'ra. Now mankind has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Va'ata, and now, pen yishlach yado, v'lakach v'achal gam me'etz ha'chaim. Right? Now maybe he'll stretch forth his hand and eat from the tree of life and eat it and live forever. So now Nachi's looking at that and saying, I can't figure out how that works. Nachi, why is that a problem for your theory? They've eaten from the tree of knowledge.
If they already ate from the tree, then...
If they already ate from the tree, they already ate from the tree. So
how are they going to... I think it's a reach to say that, okay, they're going to change. Now they're going to change their perspective.
They're going to change their perspective. And if they do, wouldn't that be what God wants? Like God would want them to train their perspective and eat it as a tree of life, right? If the whole point is you shouldn't look at it as a tree of knowledge, you should look at it as a tree of life, right? So doesn't God want that to happen? And plus, he's worried that they're going to eat it and live forever, but they already ate from it, right? So wouldn't they eat forever just from living?
Well, so it could still be perspective, though. Could be they had the wrong mindset, the wrong perspective, and they ate from it with that, certain perspective. And now what the verse is coming to say is, if now they change what they see value in the world and they change their mindset, they'll grab for what's important, which is the Eitz HaChaim.
But if you're right, play it out, right? That God's saying, I don't want you to have a tree of knowledge perspective here. I want you to have a tree of life perspective. So why do I have to banish them from the garden? Wouldn't I want them to change?
Yeah, it's not a problem if they shifted after.
Right? I guess that's sort of the punishment, though, is that they didn't.
Except the text doesn't phrase it so much as a punishment. The text phrases it as what if, like I can't have that. What if they stretch out their hand and they eat from the tree of life in an attempt to live forever? Like that would be a terrible thing, but wouldn't that be a good thing? So for about a month, I was vexed with this question until I'm hanging out in the sukkah with my kid, Avichai, who's 13, and he noticed something in the psukim that completely blew me away that I never seen, which I think was the key to the answer, right? And it's this real question, which is what makes it a tree of knowledge of good and evil, and what makes it a tree of life if it's all the same tree? So what Avichai noticed is that if you look carefully at Chava's destruction, at the eating from the tree of knowledge, you'll see that whenever you eat from the tree of knowledge, the fruit of the tree is always emphasized, right? So, for example, Chava says, no, mi pri eitz hagan nochel. We can eat from the fruit of the trees. It's just the pri of the eitz asher b'toch hagan. It's just the fruit of the tree that's b'toch hagan that we can't eat.
So it's different types.
1 second, hold on.
Yeah.
And then similarly, when she eats, she says, Vatera ishi katova vatikach mi pirio vatochal. She takes from its fruit and eats. Now, look at the word for banishment. Look at the moment of banishment. God says, okay, they've already become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Va'ata, and now, pen yishlach yado, lest he stretch forth his hand. Va'achal, gam me'etz ha'chaim, v'lakach, and he will take from the eitz ha'chaim, va'achal, and eat from it, and live forever. What's missing? And now, lest he stretch forth his hand, pen yishlach yado, v'lakach, and take from the eitz ha'chaim, va'achal,
pri
and
is
eat from
missing.
it.
Fruit.
Pri is missing.
I got
The
it.
fruit is missing. There's no fruit. When it came time to eating from the tree of knowledge, there was fruit. When it came time to eat from the tree of life, there was no fruit.
So what does that mean?
It means that the difference of whether it's a tree of life or a tree of knowledge is what part of the tree. The fruits are a tree of, the tree is a tree of life. Its fruits are knowledge of good and evil. It's the fruits
Bring it
that
home.
are the knowledge of good
Yeah,
and evil.
what does that mean?
How are you meant to relate to the tree? What does Shlomo HaMelech in Proverbs tell you about an Eitz Chaim? What do we sing every time we open an Aron and Shul about the Eitz Chaim? What are the next words? Eitz Chaim hi
Achi, take it away.
Lamachazikim.
lemachazikim ba. It's a tree of life. Shouldn't it say it's a tree of life, la'ochle pirio, to all who eat of its fruits? That would be how you access fruit. That's how it would be, right? No. It's a tree of life to all who grab hold of it. The question is, how do you access the tree?
Is that why Chava
Wow,
says
I
we
think
could?
I got it.
Is that why Chava says we could touch it? Because of course,
Yes, probably.
Is it that we shouldn't be looking at life of just taking things to eat and run, but
Yes.
we should hold on to the
Exactly.
tree. We should just grab to.
But what does that mean?
It means
Don't just go in and take and eat it and go, but
Exactly.
grab to the tree itself, which
Exactly.
is life. Grab
Don't
to
you love the
Hashem.
tree? Don't you love the tree? Don't eat and run. That's no respect
there's
to
not
the
a
tree.
drive-through. This
It's not
is-
a drive-through thing.
But holding on to the tree can't nourish me.
It can.
It can.
Okay.
Because what
It's
are
like
the
nursing
gifts
from a mother.
Right. What are the gifts that trees give you? Trees, the most obvious gift is that the gift of a tree is fruit. But what else do trees give us? You can go a long time without eating, but you can't go a long time without breathing. Where does the
Oxygen, yeah.
oxygen in the atmosphere come from?
Also 'cause
It
you
comes
shade.
from trees,
Sure.
right? By the way, where do we get our first breath of life from?
Hashem.
From God, the source of all life. God puts trees in the garden to be his instruments to provide oxygen. And there's one special tree
Boom.
that has a kind of heavenly oxygen that if you drink it in, you're connected to the source of eternal life itself. That's the tree of life.
I think we
You
need to
don't-
get
that's
Avichai on Meaningful
crazy.
People.
Right? You don't eat the tree of knowledge. And what God's saying is like, if you think you're in a drive-through theater, if you think you could just take the gifts, my words are important because they're my words. It's me. You're connecting to me. Yes, it's also good for you because you can learn morality from my words and you can figure out how to live your life, and there's a gift for that. Those are the fruits of my words. But first, connect to me, right? I'm your beloved. I sent you a love letter from Iowa. Right? Don't you want to read? Don't you want to treasure that love letter? Think of what you say in V'ahavta. V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha. B'chol levavcha, b'chol nafscha, b'chol medecha. Love your God. And therefore, v'hayu hadvarim ha'ela, asher anochi mitzavcha hayom. Those things that I command you today, you would think the next word should be you should do them. It's not you should do them. Al levavecha. They should be on your hearts. You should love them, right? You should teach them to everyone. You should talk to them. You should be lovesick over the words. You should talk to them all the time. You should have a relationship with the words because it's what's from God in our world, right? And they can teach you things, and they can teach you how to live. That's the second phase. But first, relate to them. But if you thought of the tree as a drive-through theater, that you could just take the fruit and run. And I'm so into consuming, and I have to have the fruit. And then I realized that 1 second, this tree is really powerful. What if I was the kind of guy who was like, nah, I'm not interested in touchy-feely stuff. I'm not interested in a relationship with God. A relationship with God, I don't understand relationship with God. Tell me the halacha. I want to know what to do. I want to know how to actually live my life. I'm only interested in that, right? So I don't really see God as he is. I don't see a God who loves me. I don't see a God who wants to connect to me. I see a God who makes rules. And I see a God who's very powerful because he can lay down the rules, because he's the one who knows the difference between good and evil. And then I see that I can share in that power. I too can understand the rules and all of that. And I can consume that. If you had a consumption view of the tree that just wanted its fruits, God says, what if that person came to realize that there was another power that the tree had? A power that was even greater than giving you morality, which is you started to intuit that it wasn't just the fruits that were powerful. The tree itself was powerful. There was life in that tree. And if you could take that life and consume it, maybe you would live forever. That's the ultimate power. What if and you know what Chazal say? I mentioned to you about how Chazal, once you start reading the text, Chazal pop out in a new way. Do you know Chazal say the tree might have been an esrog? Do you know why? First of all, an esrog. How are you supposed to relate to an esrog first? Right? You can make jam out of it, but what's the first way you relate to an esrog to really enjoy it? To enjoy, if you want to enjoy an esrog, you would look at it, and not just look at it. You would smell it. You'd breathe it in. Right? There's two ways of relating to the tree, right? You could just breathe in the tree and just be there and hang out with the tree, or you could slice it apart. But in esrog, Chazal say that tam etzo upirio shavin, the bark and the fruit tasted the same. Think about that. A consumption-oriented guy, if the bark and the fruit taste the same, what's God worry about? That someone would hack apart the tree to get the life out of it, to try to eat the tree itself if you realize the power that lies within it, rather than embrace the tree and be in connection to it. What if you would destroy the tree so that you could leech the life out of it? So God says, I've got to protect the tree. And all of a sudden, we're banished from Eden. Wow. These trees with God's words, and we have no more access to God's words. Think about that. Generations until Noah had no access to God's words, and it hurtled towards disaster because I was banished from a garden with God's commands. And God says, I've got to protect the tree. And so there's these angels that he sets up literally to protect the tree so that at some time in the future, it would be there and could be given again to mankind. Right? And then the next question is, so do we meet the tree of life again? When else is that given?
If we do, I'm not eating the fruits. I'm just hugging it and going there.
That's just like such an incredible like lesson. Even if in you know, I don't want people to think that we just basically learned a few psukim of a specific parsha and that was it. But this is life. And you had mentioned that it's the best Mussar Seder ever. If you just carry it over into parenting, for example, life as a parent is not just giving things to your kids. That's just giving them fruit. But giving yourself.
But he makes it easy for us because, I mean, you encourage people to go and that's the real deal, going and just trying to figure out what's going on from yourself. But I've seen so many, like, I think people listening to this are like blown away, but like you do this in like every parsha every week on Aleph Beta, like with whether it's Yosef and the brothers or just, you know, any part of the Torah.
But that's the cool thing, right? The Torah is literally a book like, we're coming out with a podcast one of these days. We're going to call it a book like no other because that's what the book is. It's a book like no other. The book itself is amazing. It's got these layers of meaning that allow you to get there. So the idea is if you can forget what you want to learn from it, if you're just willing to learn and let the Torah surprise you, all of a sudden, like this idea here, there's like 15 takeaways from this idea. It's like you've got drashas for 15 weeks just on different aspects of this that emerge from this insight.
You can shelf the Lashon Hara for a little bit.
You could shelf Lashon Hara for a little bit.
No, you probably could get Lashon Hara out of this. You know, like
you could.
Based on just, there's so many things.
That's so good.
That's right. So to me, that's the excitement. That's what it's about. It's about allowing people to say, you know what? Forget the ideas. Like, this is an amazing book. Like, God gave me a book. It's literally what we're talking about. If it's an Eitz Chaim, let's treat it like an Eitz Chaim. Let's fall in love with it, right? It's love letters. So can we help people fall in love with this book and restore that romance? Because that's where it all begins.
I also think it's so interesting because you had mentioned, like, if people would look at the Torah, and I don't hate me for this, and I hope I don't get flack for this either, but if you're watching a movie and there's a line that someone says and you're like, wait, why do they say that? You're not going to think, your first is like, well, they said it for no reason. Like, it doesn't make sense. In the back of everyone's mind, like, it's there for a reason.
Yeah.
Right? Like, your example in Shtisel, she didn't say that. Oh, she didn't make a mistake. A movie is highly produced. There's no mistakes. The Torah, there's no mistakes. Right. Every single letter, every single word is there for a reason. You have to dissect it like crazy. So if you're going to sit there watching Batman, A Dark Knight, and just be dissecting every word that everyone's saying, all the more so for every single word of the Torah, every single thing that's said, every letter, that's what you're doing. And there's so much that's being brought out because of it.
Yeah. And the amazing thing, like, also is that, if I would ask you, if I would say, Sanachi, I'm doing Shnai Mikra this year, and I'm looking for a new Mefarish, something like that's really authoritative, but something I haven't come by yet. So you say to me, well, Fohrman, what have you done? So I said, well, I've gone through Rashi one year, I did the Sforno another year, I did the Ramban. I'm looking for something, really hefty, but I haven't gone yet. So what if I told you, it's like, what's the oldest mafarish that we have on the Torah, the oldest commentary we have on the Torah? What if I told you that the oldest commentary we have on the Torah is actually the Torah itself? Could the Torah be its own commentary? And look what we did in these few minutes that we were learning together.
You're saying Shlosha Mikra is the thing?
Were stuck. Yeah. In other words, we were learning Genesis, and we were stuck in a bunch of questions, and we didn't understand what was going on. And all of a sudden, you go to Deuteronomy 30, when Moshe at the very end makes this reveal, and it's like, oh my God, I know that those trees aren't random. It's not a pink polka dotted tree and a Cadillac tree with buttons. They actually revolve around one thing, and the thing that revolving are actually God's words. And that's what was in the garden. God gave words to mankind, and it was like, how do you relate to those words? It's like, oh my gosh, how mind-blowing. Moshe just explained Bereshis to you. Right? Moshe explained Bereshis. You didn't read that from Rashi. Right. There's no Mefarish. The Mefarish was Dvarim, was the Mefarish for Bereshis.
It's a lot more difficult to do that because you have to be like mindful of what it says in Bereshis if you're learning Dvarim.
Exactly. Yeah, and you do. And by the way, one of the things our kids got into, like Avichai I mentioned, so how come Avichai, like, what was he doing at 13? So, I have to credit my daughter Ariella, who started this in the family, but Ariella in 6th grade is like, Mommy, can I participate in the Chidon HaTanach? So Chidon HaTanach
you're not allowed to. Go to your room.
Right.
Wish my kid asked me that.
Right. So Chidon HaTanach is the national Bible context. It wasn't really supported by her school, but she wanted to do it. And she got into it, and she did it for 5 years running until she aged out, and she got Avichai into it. And so Avichai in his bar mitzvah kept laning, and really got into it. And what happens is that as the words, you kind of have to do two things at once, which are a bit of a tension. But the two things are become familiar with the words of Chumash, right? So it really pays to lane. Even if you're a girl, I would say, like, learn how to do it. And even if you're not doing it in shul, do it on your own. If you can make a song out of it, you'll remember it. And so become familiar with the words, but let the words retain their freshness and always be able to come back to it and say, okay, what if I was encountering these words for the first time? Wouldn't it be really strange? Like, because that question I asked you before, which is like, there's a garden, and aren't those trees random? Like, that's a really good question, but you never thought of that question. But it's the most basic story. But how come you didn't think of that question? You're a smart guy.
Thank you, Rabbi.
The answer is because you knew the story too well. You knew the words too well. You're too close.
That's why I also feel like, I think with our episode with Amari Stoudemire, like, he was asking such, like, basic questions that were like, that's a great question. But, like, he had this fresh, childlike look at the Torah, and we were just, I guess, very jaded, and we never even figured it out. It was just like
Alex Clare's song, Too Close to Love You.
What about it?
I don't know. Just that's the name of the song.
What?
Alex Clare, he has a song, Too Close.
What did I say?
I no, because we're all saying how sometimes we're too close to something to actually bring out of what's
okay.
there.
That makes sense. I
think
like that.
I think
the analogy I give sometimes is lullabies, right?
The lullaby effect?
Think of the lullaby effect. I talk about in the beginning of that book there, The Beast That Crouches at the Door. The Torah can become like a lullaby to us. You get your kids to sleep singing Rockabye Baby. Listen to the words. What questions would you ask on Rockabye Baby? If you got Rockabye Baby on the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, right? It's a pretty gruesome tale.
That's the beginning of
but you
horror
say
movies.
it was like,
right? Don't you think if you get your kids to sleep with that song,
then a
it sounds
kid's
so
head
nice.
turns upside down.
right? If the kid could ask you a question, what question would they ask?
Why is the thing gonna break and fall?
It's like,
what?
who put the
baby
baby up there on the tree on a bell? Like, did anyone call 911 when
the
the
tree
bell
of
broke?
death.
Maybe the baby's
It's
in an orphanage. I don't
Right?
know.
Is the baby in an orphanage?
Is the baby
now?
a parent?
But there's like a bunch of these, like the Ring Around the Rosie. It's insane.
Right. It's these horror things that we read our kids. And it's like, and mommy, why are you reading this to me? Are you trying to kill me? It's like, you know what I mean? Like there's these lots of questions.
Have a good night, sweetie.
Right.
But
kids like,
to explain, you're not saying the Torah's a horror thing.
No.
You're saying the same concept of like,
It's about
we just
perspective.
say this and we kind of ingrain it and like, okay, that's the song, but we don't even understand what the words are actually saying.
Exactly. In other words, so you need the tension of I need to know the book well because I need to be perceptive and see how, one second, what's happening over there? That's talking about what's happening over here, right? Which you could only do if you know it pretty well. But you also, despite knowing it well, have to be fresh and have to be like, what if I were reading this story for the first time? Wouldn't it be strange that there are these two random trees? Like, that's a thing. I need to be thinking about that.
Do you teach laning? Because I
Do
feel
I-
like I would not get through an Aliyah with you. I'd be like 18 and you'll be like, we got
You'd have a great
finish.
shuttle though. He'd help.
I'd have a great shuttle. It would just, I would never lane.
Thankfully, I don't teach language.
So I can lane the first two psukim and that's it. Like that's.
We're already at like a mark, but and we have like fun or interesting questions that we like to ask. But I want to ask you first. I don't know if it's going to take too long, but maybe you could give a brief. Could you explain what taps on the shoulder is? His daughter lives in my building, daughter and son-in-law. So I got
see.
to schmooze with them a little before.
Yeah, that's not an al regalachas question.
I know
but
that's like another episode of this,
Right.
technically.
Sure. It is another episode. If you'd like, you can package it as another episode. I'll leave you guys figure out how to do that, but I'll give you a brief look at the taps on the shoulder thing. So I was doing a, let's see. So what happened basically was I was going through the story of how Yosef interprets Pharaoh's dream. Yosef has this ability to interpret Pharaoh's dream, but it's not clear that God came to him out of the blue and said, hey, Yosef, here's what the dream means. And I developed a theory that I gave in a talk. It's on Aleph Beta. It's also a talk I gave in person to folks, that what Yosef was really doing was that the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream was actually ingrained in his words. In other words, the words of the dream contained the interpretation, which he has this dream of these cows, right? And the ugly cows are devoured alive by the beautiful cows, and he doesn't know what it means. We know what it means. Yosef knows what it means. The cows represent years, but it's unclear how Yosef knows that secret, which is how did he know that the 7 beautiful cows represent 7 beautiful years? Once I know that cows equal years, so then I know that obviously 7 beautiful cows are going to be 7 beautiful years, but how did you know that cows equal years? So the theory I developed, which you can watch on Aleph Beta, it'll take too long to go through here, is that Yosef was actually really doing what we were doing, the same thing you can observe text and the text begins to reveal itself to you. The text in this case is the text of Pharaoh's dream. There's something about Pharaoh's dream which is indicating that cows equal years. But now you say to yourself, so how come Yosef was the only one to figure that out? I mean, there's lots of astrologers in the room with lots of skin in the game. If you're the guy who figures out the meaning of Pharaoh's dream, right, you have a lot to gain from that. So how come Yosef is the only guy who can figure it out? The answer is the tap on the shoulder idea. The answer is that if you were God, right, how would you encode meaning in the dream such that it was only accessible to Yosef, but not accessible to any of the astrologers? So tell me, how would you do that? Let's say you were God and you were faced with this task, right? You had to make Yosef understand what the dream meant. So you had to put hidden meaning in the dream, but that hidden meaning had to only resonate with Yosef.
I do something in Yosef's life. That
Exactly. You'd do something in Yosef's life. What you would do is you would pick events in Yosef's life that start to resonate, right? With this, it won't resonate for anyone else, but they'll resonate for Yosef because Yosef will see his life in the dream. So what happens is that as you start to read the story of the dream, you start to realize that Yosef is having these deja vu moments that remind him of his own life as he's listening. So, for example, when Pharaoh pulls him out of prison, the language is Vayishlach Pharaoh vayiritzu min habor. He took him out of the pit, but it's not a pit, right? He was in prison, but Yosef was in a pit, right? And it's almost like the Torah is confusing the narratives between pit, and then Yosef gets these new clothes. But remember, when Yosef was in the pit, the last thing he lost before he went in the pit was his beautiful new clothes, and now he's getting those new clothes. So what happens is that the events, and then he comes to Pharaoh, much as he left his own father. The events are the reverse of what happened to him in order, right? 17 years ago. Anyway, without getting into it in detail, if you connect the dots, the last dot is C equals Y, cows equal years, right? And I won't reveal to you how that happens. You can watch an Aleph Beta. But when I was giving this talk in a city that will remain nameless to protect the innocent, a Midwestern city. Let's call it Cleveland. Wasn't Cleveland, but we'll call it Cleveland. I gave this talk in Cleveland to a group of 25 folks, and I kind of ended off the talk by saying, "Hey, so what do you get out of all of this, right? What does it mean?" I said, what it means is that God can actually communicate with people in non-prophetic ways. Right, which is like an amazing kind of thing. In other words, it wasn't that Yosef had prophecy, right? Avram had prophecy. Yaakov had prophecy, right? God never comes to Yosef and says, "This is the Lord. Yosef, I'm speaking to you." He never comes to any of the Shvatim, and there is no prophecy in that generation in Bereshit, strangely enough. But that doesn't mean that God was silent. God was speaking to Yosef through the dream. And all Yosef had to do was be aware of what was there and feel these deja vu moments, almost like taps on the shoulder, right? And it's like, and you could see God was talking to you. So I raised this very basic question, which is, okay, so we don't believe we have prophecy nowadays, but does that mean God is silent in our lives? Does that mean that God never talks to you, right? Does that mean, Nachi, that you can daven to God 3 times a day, right? And Yaakov, Nachi, right?
Yeah, we're interchangeable.
And God never talks to you. Like, like if you had a friend that you talked to all the time and they never said a word in response, like, would you give up and move on? Are you supposed to not be bothered about that when it comes to God? Or is it possible that God actually can talk to you, right? It's just you have to kind of listen. But could there be those tap on the shoulder moments which are simply beyond the pale of coincidence, right? That I at least, like, has there ever been a moment where you said, you know what, in that one moment, I think God was talking to me there. I really felt that. That wasn't a coincidence. That was this one little moment in my life that I really felt was God was present in my life. And if that's really true, as it was true for Yosef, it's actually life-changing. Because a lot of people in their lives, they don't really see themselves as walking with God. If I asked you, I said, when you walk down Central Avenue, do you really think God is there? Do you feel like you're being accompanied, like there's another set of footsteps there? And it's like, it's a nice frum thing to say, you know what I mean? Like, sure, I always feel like, but like, honestly, we feel alone. Like, who feels like and you say to yourself, why do you feel alone? If I said to you, Yaakov, you're a frum guy, you're Orthodox, you believe in this whole system, so why do you feel so alone? So you'd say, look, I'm one guy, I run this little podcast in Cedarhurst, I'm doing my thing. God's the master of the universe, you know what I mean? He's got the Andromeda galaxy to worry about. There's 7 billion people here on Earth. You think I rate enough that, like, literally I'm being accompanied by the master of the universe right along? But if there's a moment in your life where you were quite sure that wasn't true, that God was walking with you then, that was God, so that actually completely blows your alibi to smithereens, right? Because if God really is the master of the universe and you don't rate, you're not important enough, then he shouldn't have been with you then.
At any moment.
At any moment.
And if he was with at any moment, then he could be in every moment.
Exactly. So it's life-changing. If he was at that moment, he can be with you at every moment. You just weren't observant enough.
So we could experience things like Yosef Atzadik experienced.
Possibly. So my question is, was that a one-time thing? Okay, so now I gave this talk in Cleveland, and there's a guy in the back of the room who was a bit of a smart aleck, right, who asked the obvious question, right, a question that you would probably ask if I gave you the chance to ask it, which is, okay, Fohrman, I hear you with this tap on the shoulder things. Tell me, have you ever experienced any of these tap on the shoulder moments yourself? Now, honestly, I wasn't prepared for that question, right? And it was a kind of embarrassing question to ask, right? Because like, I'm not prepared for this. Like, I don't even know. Like, and what I'm supposed to give a whole talk on tap of the shoulder moments, and then it's like, well, honestly, I haven't really even, experienced much of that myself. Now, the honest truth is that in the talk itself, I had actually had those moments in discovering what I discovered about Yosef and Paro's dream. There were like these crazy coincidences. Like, I'll tell you one of them, which is like, but I didn't hop at the point in time. I didn't give that answer. I mean, what happened was that I had seen some of the evidence for the theory that I was developing, but I had misinterpreted the evidence. And months earlier, I gave a version of this of the talk that I gave in Cleveland that I now consider to be wrong. The evidence was there. It was very powerful evidence, but my conclusion, I jumped to a conclusion that wasn't warranted, and my conclusion was wrong, and I didn't see it as having anything to do with taps on the shoulder or anything else. But I gave like a respectable talk in shul. Everyone thought it was great. I'm walking home with my wife, and I said to her, so what do you think of the talk? So she said, it's pretty good except for the end. Yeah. So I said, what was wrong with the end? She said, trust me, you don't have it yet. Maybe one day you'll get it, but that wasn't it. So like, I thought it was it. Like I thought I was right. So like the whole Shabbos afternoon, I'm very preoccupied by this. Like my wife thought I was wrong. Like I was right. Of course I was right. Right. Next day, I'm supposed to go to Baltimore to give a talk there. And I'm on the Amtrak train. I'm supposed to be preparing my talk, but I'm totally preoccupied with this. It's like, I think I was right. What is she telling me I was wrong for? So I said, you know what? I'm not going to prepare this talk. I'm going to get up. I'm going to fetch out my Tanakh from my backpack. And I'm going to... take a look at these psukim again, read them again, and I'll see why I was really right. So I get up, fish out my Tanakh, and right as I'm doing that, the train goes around a sharp curve. I lose my balance, and I completely just, fell over into the aisle next to me. My Tanakh goes sprawling. My notes go sprawling. It's very embarrassing. Spill the Diet Coke over the person next to me, right? Collect my things. Very, very sorry, right? Sat down in the chair. And what happened is that I had my thumb on the Yosef story, which is chapter 37. I was going to look at it to figure out what I needed to figure out and compare it to chapter 41. And all of a sudden, my Tanakh wasn't open to that page anymore. It was open to another page, 14 chapters earlier, right? And I'm about to switch to the page I'm supposed to look at when a pasuk caught my eye in that chapter 14 chapters earlier. And that pasuk was the key to understanding the meaning of Yosef, how Yosef interpreted Paro's dream 14 chapters earlier. The same way that we saw, Dvarim 30 held the key to the beginning of Bereshis. This chapter, 14 verses earlier, held the key. This one pasuk caught my eye. It's like, oh my gosh. And that's actually how I discovered it. But at the moment when he asked me this question, so Fohrman, have you ever had these tap on the shoulder moments? It didn't even register to me that was really true. Sometimes these things happen to you and you don't even realize what they are. It's just like, it's part of regular life. And you have to stop yourself and say, so what really happened there? So what happened is that I was caught flat-footed. He asked me this very personal question that I didn't have a good answer for. So I expertly evaded the question. And what I did was, I told a personal story, and the personal story was personal enough, right, that it completely distracted the audience and him from what he was really asking. And in the end, I didn't really answer the question. So the answer I gave, the story I gave, was I said, okay, let me tell you why I'm interested in this topic. I said, I'm interested in this topic because years ago in Berkeley, California, when I was a kid growing up in Berkeley, my father was a psychiatrist there, and he was struggling with cancer. And he felt that he had these tap on the shoulder moments. He was quite sure of them. They came in all shapes and sizes, but one of them was dreams. He had this dream that he was in remission at the time. The cancer had gone away, and everything was fine. And he had this dream, and in the dream he saw these two monsters fighting, and in the background of the dream were all the different places that he lived in order. And then the last place was our front yard in Berkeley, California. And in our front yard, one monster kills another, and he wakes up, and it's the end of the dream. And he's thinking to himself, and the last thing he saw was the face of the clock, 4:51. He wakes up and it's 4:51, just like the clock. And he feels like too many coincidences in this dream. I don't know. What's this dream telling me? Is this telling me that the cancer's back and that this is the final act? I really should see my oncologist. And Kachava, he went to see his oncologist. They took a scan and the cancer had come back. And this was like the final act. So I was young at the time. I was 9, 10 years old. But as I mentioned to you before, he would share a lot of sophisticated stuff with me at a young age. And he shared this with me, and would share these dreams with me and these taps on the shoulder kind of thing. And he would be very honest with me. He would say, I don't know, this is the dream I had. I really think that this was meaningful. And he would talk about, walking with God in this kind of way, like it was real, very real to him. Anyway, so if you're a kid, and your dad shares a dream like that with you, it's pretty heavy for a 10-year-old kid. So I had to process it. So I'm in school. So who am I going to talk about? I want to talk about with somebody. So I went to my 5th grade Rebbe, and I said, can I get a little time to talk with you? So he said, sure. So I talked to him. I said, do you think, and remember, I'm this long-haired kid from Berkeley, California, right? And I say, do you think it's possible that, like dreams, that God could really talk to us in dreams? He could come to us and that would really be meaningful. So here he is looking at me, this little hippie kid in California, and this kid is talking to you about God speaking to him in dreams, and you're the Rebbe. So what are you going to say? It's like, no, my child, I don't know who's feeding you this stuff, but God does not talk to you in dreams. It doesn't happen. Right? Put this out of your mind. It's just him. It has nothing to do with anything. We don't believe in any of that, right? So I go back to my father, and I said, my tactless 10-year-old self, I said, I was talking to my Rebbe, and he thinks it's all nonsense. He doesn't believe in this dream stuff. So my father just kind of smiled and said, you know what? If I was in his shoes, I'd probably think it's nonsense too. But I'm not in his shoes. I'm in my shoes. I'm just telling you my experience. This is my experience. This is what's happening to me. So, like, for years after he died, it had always kind of plagued me. Like, who was right? Was my Rebbe right or was my father right? And you never really have this answer until you kind of stumble upon this Yosef and Paro's dream thing. And you see, like, in the Chumash itself, this thing was real. Like, God actually communicated that way by you can encode in experience these resonances of people's lives. And it's a way, it's not prophecy, but it's meaningful, and it's a way of communicating. So that was the answer I gave the guy. But as I got into the car after that talk, it dawned on me that I really had evaded the question, because the question wasn't, give me an example of a tap on the shoulder moment. It was, have you ever experienced these tap on the shoulder moments? And I told this story about my dad who had experienced that, but I didn't really tell it about myself. And so there I was, heading off into the sunset. And there was one last talk I was giving in the city. It's a much larger crowd of like 300 people. And I was exhausted. I'd been up till 3 a.m. the night before. And I just said, you know what, I'm going to give the same talk. And I had this PowerPoint I was going to set up. And we got there late. And I was under a lot of pressure because my computer wasn't connecting to their equipment properly. So there's this huge crowd of people. They're waiting for this thing to start, trying to get these wires to connect to this computer. I'm on the floor trying this and trying that. The clock is ticking. I'm sweating. And all of a sudden, there's this... and by the way, it occurred to me on the car ride there, like, why did you evade that question? Probably because, like, I had nothing to say. Mm-hmm. Like, I didn't feel like I had these moments, but it was embarrassing to say. I didn't feel like I wasn't going to say that, right? Anyway, so I'm there on the floor, and I'm putting together my computer stuff, and some guy comes over to me and wants to play Jewish geography with me. And it's like, Rabbi, do you remember me, right? Don't you remember me? And it's like, do we really have to play Jewish geography now? Like, I have to get up. Like, don't you see that I'm trying to actually connect my computer to give a talk? I really don't have the time to talk right now. But he's like, would not take no for an answer. He's like, but Rabbi Fohrman's like, don't you remember me? And finally I get up and it's like, okay, fine. I get up and I look at this guy. He says, don't you remember me? And I look at him. I say, I do remember you. You're my 5th grade Rebbe from Berkeley, California. It was him 25 years later, right? There he was in Cleveland. And it's like, and it just completely went over my head until after this talk, it was just quiet. And I just thought to myself, do you realize what just happened there?
That's why you evaded the question.
It's like I had evaded these questions. And it's like, so what's God saying when I evade those questions, right? It's like, hey, Fohrman, why'd you evade those questions? How come you didn't give an answer over there, right? Well, you feeling there's not enough tap on the shoulder lately? You think you don't get any taps on the shoulder? Okay, we'll give you a tap on the shoulder. God's sense of humor. What's the tap you're going to get? It's going to be the guy who comes and says there's no such thing as taps on the shoulder. That's your guy.
It's really wild. I'm glad we got that story in. And I know there's so many more stories and concepts that we should discuss with you. So maybe hopefully the next time you return here, we could have you back. But until then, we end off with a few fun questions. So Nachi's going to start it off.
If you can meet anybody from history that's no longer alive, just for an hour, sit down with them, who would it be?
I think this question for you in particular is an awesome question to ask.
Yeah.
Oh, gee. Those are really, I mean, to me, it would be 2 of the people who are captivating me from Tanakh, frankly. I mean, if it's anybody from history.
Anyone.
Yeah, if it's anybody from history. Yeah, the 2 people, if I can pick 2, it's actually 2 women, right? It would probably be the daughter of Pharaoh.
Really?
Yeah. And it would be Rachel.
Right.
Right, Rachel Imenu.
Why are you saying right? As if like...
Rachel, like, that's like...
No, but it's such an interesting answer from him. I thought he'd say like Yosef or Moshe.
Why? Rachel is like the strength to what she did, what she's done. Like, come on, yeah. But daughter of Pharaoh.
No, but okay, but I'm curious why each of those?
Why each of those? So each of those did some, sometimes in life, I had when I worked on the Artscroll Shas project, so my boss was Yechezkel Danziger, who's the head of the Shas project, an amazing scholar and a person who was a real mentor for me. So one Erev Yom Kippur, he called me. He said, David, the problem with life is that it doesn't come with a soundtrack. He says, when you watch a movie, right, you get a soundtrack, and the soundtrack helps you understand the movie because when the violins swell, you know that some climactic romantic thing is going to happen. When the kettle drums happen, like the bad guy is back. But life doesn't come with a soundtrack. So you can have like the really most important moments of your life that you don't know at the time are the most important moments of your life. And it's like, Olam Haba, maybe you see your life with the soundtrack and you realize that moment over there, I never really paid attention to it, but that was crucial. It strikes me that each of these 2 women had those moments, right? Bas Pharaoh, if you would ask her, what's your life about, right, on any given day of the week, what's her life about? She's royalty, right? She's the crown. She's Claire Foy. She's, you know what I mean? And her life is about the palace and about all of this, but nobody remembers any of that. What made her immortal for generations was a single act, right? She sees a child crying in the bulrushes. She takes compassion on the child, and she has this moment where she's pulled, where her father says, right, genocide. Her father says, throw these babies in the Nile, and she's got to listen to her father. On the other hand, there's an actual human being, right, who's crying, and she's compassionate, and then she realizes cognitively, miyaldei ivrim zeh, that it's a Hebrew child, and what does she do with that? And Chazal famously say that her arm stretched, right? And if you think about that, it's like one of those Chazal that seems crazy. It's like what, she's the Fantastic Four, like her arm stretches, and she, if that, and it's one of those moments where the Medrash with a wink and a nod is actually telling you what's happening in Pshat. It's not saying in Pshat that her arm stretched, right? She sent her maidservant. The word for arm is the same as maidservant. Vatishlach es amasa. She sends her arm, and which Chazal, her maidservant, which Chazal says is really her arm. But what Chazal, I think, are saying is that in essence, by sending her maidservant, she was sending her arm. It's like in life, there's certain things you can do and certain things you can't do, right? We're constrained by our circumstances. If I want to go disco dancing one night and I'm a rabbi, there's certain things you just don't do. If you're the daughter of Pharaoh, you just don't do that, right? You can't go. Right? What does she do? She takes that child. Not only does she save the child, she raises the child in the palace of the king as her own son. How does she even get away with that? It's crazy that she should have been able to get away with that. It's literally like her arms stretched, like she did something that she had no business doing. She reached for something that she couldn't reach for. And sometimes Chazal are saying when you reach for something that you can't reach for, God makes your arm stretch and you're able to achieve something which you absolutely had no idea. As a matter of fact, I would go so far as to suggest, that phrase which you hear over and over again in the Exodus, that God redeemed us, bizroa nutuya, with an outstretched arm. Mm-hmm. I think the reason why the Torah uses that phrase, why God himself uses that phrase over and over again, is because the outstretched arm, the first outstretched arm in the story, is the daughter of Pharaoh. Right. In other words, God is mimicking the daughter of Pharaoh, that there was a human being who had that kind of courage to stretch out her arm for something that shouldn't be able to do. So the way that the Exodus comes about is through my stretched out arm. All I'm doing is taking my lead from her. So to me, seeing somebody whose act has reverberated, right, for thousands of years, that became, the namer of our Savior. Moshe gets his name from her, right? That would be really something to be able to meet her. Rachel, a similar reason.
The batteries are mamish dying, so you have to go as quick as possible. Sorry, apologies.
Sure. And Rachel, the same idea. I don't have time, but if you go into Aleph Beta, we have our most popular video there. It's called The Power of Rachel's Tears. And it analyzes a seemingly insignificant moment in Rachel's life, a discussion that she once had with her co-wife and sister Leah, which seems to be her hidden moment of greatness. So I'd love to be able to ask her about that too.
Yeah, that's amazing. So everyone go to Aleph Beta to see that. We're going to finish off with 2 questions super quick. Apologies for rushing you. The question is, what is your favorite mitzvah?
What is my favorite mitzvah? That's a good question. What is my favorite? I mean, obviously, this is going to sound like a cliche, but the whole discussion here gets back to the power of learning Torah, and what it's really learning Torah in a way that is surprising and striking, and that I can fall in love with. Really, everything I'm doing in Aleph Beta is really just trying to share with others what I feel, right? And the kind of love that I can feel for it. It sounds crazy, you fall in love with a book, right? But you can fall in love with a book. So if I can share that, that's great. So that mitzvah to me is the one that resonates most for me.
I think we're good. We always ask people what their best and worst advice, but at Mitzvah, hopefully in a year or 2 we can have you back.
Okay.
But for everyone listening, what's the best way to interact with Aleph Beta? Could you throughout the
Sure. So Aleph Beta is hard to spell. It's ALEPHBETA. If that's hard, ab.video will get you there also.
If Aleph Beta is hard to spell for someone, then it's not for them.
.org or .com?
So it's .org. Okay. And if you just look on your app store, we have apps also, so you can download on your app store. Just look for Torah videos. The first thing will pop up will be Torah videos by Aleph Beta. And we've got hundreds of hours of stuff there, and it's a whole library, and it hopefully it's immersive and it pulls you in. It's free for the casual user. If you use more than half an hour a month, we ask you to pitch in $9, and you get a subscription that gives you unlimited access to everything.
And you don't have to say the number, but if you want, you've like hundreds, I would say thousands of subscribers.
Yeah, we've actually got 60,000 free subscribers. I think it might be more, about 11,000 actual paying subscribers.
Wow.
So it's wonderful. And we appreciate, a lot of, when we decided early on that how to do this, on the one hand, people said, nobody will ever pay anything for Torah, even if it's just a few bucks a month. But we hated raising money so much that the prospect of having a lifetime of having to sit in offices of rich people and ask them for money just seemed so right. So we said, look, let's try it. We're try to crowdfund it, and in the end, crowdfunding really worked. So we do invite larger donors, and there's always dreams that we can build with
Producer
them. Producer Circle. But the Producer Circle is a cadre of donors that want to get behind us and give a little bit more than the $9 a month. So we invite you to join that. But the idea that we're supported by our users is a beautiful thing, and it makes us accountable to the right people instead of being accountable to some random guy who decided they were going to give you $1 million to do this. It does take money, right? What we really are is a research Torah institute together with Netflix and a movie studio, all in an internet startup. So it takes money to run, but to be supported by the users means that we're accountable to them, which is, I think, a special and good thing.
Really love that. And the books that you graciously brought, where could someone find those books to buy?
So you can get them at any good Jewish bookstore, Amazon, or Koren. Koren actually has taken them over, and they are our publisher now. So you can go to Koren's website, or you can go to our website. Aleph Beta sells all the books at the shop. Sometimes we have goodies to give you along with the books. I think we're starting to give an interview, which is a 13-year retrospective on The Beast That Crouches at the Door.
Oh, wow.
So I wrote that book 13 years ago and kind of taking you through my thinking since.
That's amazing.
So you can get that too.
Rabbi David Fohrman, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Nachi and Yaakov, thanks for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
Okay, hope you guys enjoyed. We definitely have to get him back to just get into more stories and just more Torah with him. I found interesting, we interview a lot of people, and he's one of the only people that came in here with a chumash, because he's like, I need to be using it during. Of course, it's gonna come up during the interview. I thought it was right.
Well, I think Zusha came with like something. It wasn't.
They didn't come with
a
like
Baba Sali sefer and a bottle of wine.
You're right. They didn't come with the opener. Remember, they're like, do you have a bottle opener? We're like,
Yeah.
I don't know about that. But thanks so much for listening, and get ready for next week. We have someone that we've been really trying to get for a very long time, and we finally got her. Should we say who it is, or should we?
Sure.
Okay, it is. I know her as Lily's Promise, right? But it's Lily Ebert, and really incredible person. And we have her and her great grandson on Dove, and yeah, it's a really fun time. And don't forget,
It's a fun time talking about the Holocaust. Yeah.
well, with her, she's such a fun person. But don't forget to check out the JOWMA. Am I saying it properly? JOWMA podcast, wherever you get your podcast. Really great stuff. And
ciao.